On the 14th of December 1972, a man named Eugene Cernan climbed a short metal ladder and stepped off the surface of the moon for the last time. Before he did, he knelt down in the gray lunar dust and traced 3 letters with his finger. TDC, the initials of his young daughter, Tracy, knowing as he pressed them into the soil that they would stay there undisturbed for longer than anyone alive could imagine. Then he stood up, looked out at the valley of Taurus Littrow one final time, and spoke words he had clearly rehearsed, words intended to carry the weight of the moment. As I take man's last step from the surface, back home for some time to come, but we believe not too long into the future, I'd like to just say what I believe history will record, that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. And as we leave the moon at Taurus Littrow, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return with peace and hope for all mankind. He believed it. He meant it. He was wrong. Not wrong about the peace or the hope, but wrong about the returning. Because 53 years passed between the moment Cernan climbed that ladder and the moment when human beings finally swung around the moon again, not landing, just flying past, looking down at the gray surface from a distance, aboard the Artemis II spacecraft on the 1st of April 2026. More than half a century. 3 generations of children who grew up, had children of their own, and watched those children grow up. All of them living in a world where human beings had once walked on the moon, and then, for reasons that were never quite satisfactorily explained, simply stopped. And the question that haunted Cernan for the rest of his life, he died in January 2017, still the last man to have walked on the moon, still voicing his disappointment openly and publicly, is the question this story is going to answer properly, not with conspiracy theories, not with alien intervention or secret government cover-ups, with the truth, which turns out to be more complicated, more political, more human, and in some ways more unsettling than any alternative explanation the internet has ever offered. Before you can understand why we stopped, you have to understand why we started. And the reason we started is one that tends to get sentimentalized out of its actual nature in the retelling. John Kennedy did not stand before Congress in May 1961 and challenge America to reach the moon because he had a romantic vision of human exploration. He did it because the United States was losing. Losing badly, losing visibly, losing in a way that was damaging American credibility around the world at exactly the moment when the Cold War was at its most dangerous. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite, catching the Americans completely off guard. In 1961, they had put Yuri Gagarin into orbit, the first human being in space, while America's own rockets were still blowing up, on their launch pads in embarrassingly public failures. The space race was not, in its origins, about science or exploration or the destiny of humanity. It was about geopolitics. It was about demonstrating to a watching world of nations choosing between the capitalist and communist models of development that American technology and American society were superior. Kennedy chose the moon because it was the most dramatic possible target, the one that would produce the most spectacular demonstration of superiority if achieved, that the Soviets had not yet publicly claimed as their goal. That is the context inside which NASA was born and the Apollo program was built. And it is the context inside which, when the geopolitical purpose of the program had been achieved, it was dismantled. The logic was always political. When the politics changed, so did the program. The politics changed fast. Apollo 11 landed on the moon on the 20th of July, 1969. Neil Armstrong stepped onto the surface. Buzz Aldrin followed. The world watched on grainy black and white television. America had won. The space race was over, and the moment it was total, the political will that had sustained the program at enormous cost began to evaporate almost immediately. NASA had plans, proposed a vision for the next decade that included a permanent space station in Earth orbit, a base on the moon, and a crewed mission to Mars by 1981. 1981. If the political will to pursue it had existed, it was technically feasible. The Saturn V rocket that had taken men to the moon was the most powerful machine ever built. The technology was there. The engineering expertise was there. 400,000 people had built the Apollo program. The momentum was there. What was not there was the will to pay for it. Nixon looked at the proposal and said, no, not to all of it. He was not going to shut down the space program entirely, but to the grand vision, the moon base, the Mars mission, the full program that might have taken humanity from its first lunar landing to a permanent presence in the solar system within a decade. He said no because the money did not exist, and because the political coalition that had created Apollo had fractured. The Cold War rationale for the program was gone. America had beaten the Soviets. The point had been made. And the domestic situation in 1969 was one in which the case for spending billions of dollars going to the moon was becoming harder and harder to make. Cities were burning. Vietnam was consuming lives and treasure at a catastrophic rate. The civil rights movement was demanding that domestic social inequalities be addressed. Student protests were tearing campuses apart. In this environment, Apollo, however spectacular, looked to many Americans like an embarrassingly expensive luxury. James Webb, who had built NASA into what it was, had already resigned. The agency's budget had been declining since 1966, 3 years before the first landing. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. At its peak in 1965 and 1966, NASA's budget consumed more than 4% of the entire federal budget. 4%. That was the price of going to the moon on Kennedy's timeline. By 1969, when the landing actually happened, the budget was already falling. By the early 1970s, it had dropped to barely 1%. And a 50% cut in budget is not a 50% reduction in ambition. It is the destruction of ambition. It forced choices, hard, permanent, irreversible choices. The first to go was Apollo 20, canceled in January 1970. Its Saturn V rocket redirected to launch the Skylab space station because the Saturn V production line had already been shut down in 1968, and there were no more rockets coming. Then, in September 1970, Apollos 18 and 19 were canceled. NASA Administrator Thomas Paine wrote to Nixon explaining the decision with the language of bureaucratic regret but absolute clarity. The most compelling reason, he said, was the current and austere funding situation. Risk was mentioned too. Each mission was genuinely dangerous, and each one that flew without disaster was a spin of a roulette wheel. But the primary driver was money. There was no other reason. The Saturn Verse that would have taken 12 more astronauts to the moon were repurposed or turned into museum exhibits, where they remain to this day, lying on their sides in visitor centers, the most powerful machines ever built, never to fly again. Apollo 17 flew in December 1972 as planned, the last mission already funded and built, and it was in many respects the most scientifically accomplished of all the lunar landings. Gene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt, the only professional geologist ever to walk on the moon, spent 3 days in the Taurus. Littrow Valley drove their lunar rover more than 30 kilometers across the surface, collected more than 100 kilograms of rock samples, and documented their findings with a thoroughness that reflected their awareness that they were doing something that would not be repeated soon, if ever. Schmidt identified orange soil that turned out to be ancient volcanic glass beads, a finding of genuine scientific importance. Cernan drove the rover to a point far enough from the lunar module that the camera mounted on it could film their departure. A final, deliberate act of documentation, as if he understood that this footage would have to last a long time. It has lasted 53 years. In the years immediately following Apollo 17, there were genuine attempts to revive the program, or at least to plan a successor. Project Constellation, announced under President George W. Bush in 2004 and aimed at returning humans to the moon by 2020, was canceled by President Barack Obama in 2010, its budget overwhelmed by cost overruns and its timeline unrealistic. The cycle of announcement, planning, and cancellation repeated itself with dispiriting regularity, driven each time by the same underlying dynamic. The political will to commit the sustained funding that returning to the moon actually required was never sufficient in peacetime, without the external pressure of a superpower rival visibly competing for the same goal. And here's the truth that Gene Cernan spent the last years of his life trying to say plainly, in interview after interview, in congressional testimony, in speeches to students and aerospace professionals. The reason we stopped going to the moon was not technical. It was never technical. The technology that took 12 men to the lunar surface between 1969 and 1972 was not lost. The engineering knowledge was not erased. The basic physics did not change. What was lost was the political will to pay for it. Cernan was quite disappointed, as he put it in one of his characteristic understatements, to still be the last man on the moon. He said repeatedly that it said more about what America had not done than about what it had done. He died 8 years before the next human beings flew around the moon. Apollo 14 astronaut Stu Roosa said it more bluntly. Quoted by space historian Andrew Chaikin, Roosa remarked that history would not be kind to the decision to end Apollo because, and this is the actual quote, "We were stupid. Not technically limited, not physically blocked, not warned off by alien presences or confronted with existential dangers on the lunar surface. Stupid. In the specific sense that a civilization capable of achieving something extraordinary chose not to continue doing it because the short-term political calculus made it easier to stop than to keep going. The vacuum that Apollo left behind was filled, as vacuums in human psychology tend to be, with alternative explanations. The conspiracy theories that insist the moon landings were faked, still believed by a measurable fraction of the population in multiple countries, are in many ways a response to the cognitive dissonance of the real story. Because the real story requires holding two contradictory things in mind simultaneously. that humanity actually accomplished something of almost incomprehensible difficulty and went to the moon 12 times, and that having done so, it simply walked away from it for over half a century because the politics were inconvenient. That is a strange and uncomfortable truth. It is easier in some ways to believe that we never went at all, or that we went and found something terrifying, than to accept that we went, found something extraordinary, and then stopped because Congress didn't want to pay for it anymore. The alternative theories, radiation belts that are impossible to pass through, encounters with extraterrestrial structures, government cover-ups of what was found on the surface, all share a common function. They provide an explanation that makes the decision to stop feel necessary and inevitable, rather than chosen and avoidable. If the Van Allen radiation belts are impassable, we couldn't go back, even if we wanted to. If we were warned off by something on the surface, stopping was the rational response. These explanations preserve the idea that stopping was required. The reality, that stopping was a political choice made by accountants and politicians weighing competing budget priorities, is somehow harder to accept, even though it is the one supported by every piece of documentary evidence that exists. The declassified records are extensive. The budget documents, the internal NASA memos, the communications between NASA administrators and the White House, the congressional hearings, they tell a consistent, detailed, entirely mundane story of a program killed by money. Nixon's aide telling NASA in December 1969 that the president says that he doesn't have enough money within the next couple of years and must accept limitation of activity. Nixon himself saying he did not see the need to go to the moon 6 more times. The NASA budget declining by 50% in buying power over the course of the 1970s. The production line for the Saturn V rocket shut down in 1968, before Apollo 11 even flew, because the decision had already been made at a bureaucratic level that the program would not extend beyond what was already contracted. What the Apollo astronauts have said publicly and repeatedly, across decades of interviews and memoirs, is entirely consistent with this picture. They are not people with secrets about alien encounters or government cover-ups. They are people with a very specific and specific grievance that something extraordinary was achieved and then discarded for reasons that had nothing to do with the achievement itself. Buzz Aldrin has spent decades advocating for a Mars program, channeling the frustration of someone who walked on the moon and watched the infrastructure that took him there be dismantled behind him. Harrison Schmitt, the geologist who picked up the orange volcanic glass on the moon and brought it back to Earth, went on to become a United States senator and has spent years arguing for the scientific and economic potential of lunar resources, including helium-3, which exists on the moon, in quantities that could be valuable for fusion energy. Charlie Duke, who walked on the moon during Apollo 16, has spoken about the decision to end the program with a straightforwardness that admits no mystery. It was about money and about political will, and about the fact that once America had beaten the Soviets, the rationale that had sustained the program was gone. Now in 2026, the picture is finally beginning to change. On the 1st of April 2026, 53 years, 3 months, and 17 days after Cernan stepped off the lunar surface, 4 astronauts climbed into an Orion spacecraft atop NASA's Space Launch System rocket at Kennedy Space Center and flew around the moon, not landing. A lunar flyby, a 10-day voyage that took NASA astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, and Christina Koch, along with Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen, further from Earth than any human being had traveled since Apollo 17. They named their capsule Integrity. They splashed down in the Pacific on the 10th of April, and for the first time in more than half a century, human beings had been to the vicinity of the moon and come home safely. The first actual lunar landing under the Artemis program is currently targeted for early 2028. Not a flags and footprints mission in the Apollo model, but the beginning of something intended to be sustainable. A program aimed at establishing a long-term human presence on and around the moon, with a lunar base as its eventual goal and Mars as its ultimate horizon. The Artemis program is explicitly designed to avoid the trap that ended Apollo. Instead of a single massive government program dependent on sustained high-level political support, it incorporates commercial partners, international collaboration with space agencies from Europe and Canada and Japan, and a modular approach that distributes the risk and the cost in ways that make it harder to cancel with a single political decision. Whether it will succeed where Apollo's successors failed is a question that only time can answer. The Artemis program has already experienced years of delays, cost overruns, political interference, and the recurring tension between ambition and budget that has sabotaged every previous attempt to return. The lunar landing has already slipped from 2024 to 2025 to 2026 to its current target of 2028. The history of the post-Apollo period is littered with plans that were announced, delayed, restructured, and finally canceled. Artemis has survived further than most of its predecessors. But survival and completion are not the same thing. What is not in question is the reason for the 53-year gap. Apollo 17 astronaut Harrison Schmitt, the only scientist ever to walk on the moon, has been consistent and specific about it across decades of public statements. The decision to end Apollo was a political decision made under budget pressure, not a technical or scientific decision, and it was the wrong decision. Cernan was equally explicit and equally consistent, right up to his death. Neither man claimed hidden knowledge. Neither man hinted at classified encounters or suppressed discoveries. Both men pointed again and again at the same target, political will and the lack of it. There's a particular kind of loss in the story of Apollo that is easy to miss if you approach it looking for secrets and find only ordinary political failure. Because the ordinary failure is enormous. 12 human beings walked on the surface of another world. They drove across its surface in electric vehicles. They collected its rocks and brought them back and handed them to scientists who are, to this day, in 2026, still making new discoveries from those samples. Harrison Schmitt's orange glass beads are still being studied. The seismometers left on the lunar surface by Apollo astronauts recorded moonquakes for years after the program ended. The retroreflectors placed on the moon by Apollo crews are still there, still functional, still being used by laser ranging experiments on Earth to measure the moon's distance to millimeter precision. Apollo is still doing science, and the moon itself, the one that Cernan looked at for the last time before climbing that ladder, is still there, still covered in the boot prints of 12 human beings, preserved in the airless vacuum exactly as they were left, because there is no wind and no rain and no erosion on the moon to disturb them. Tracy Cernan's initials are still there in the dust. Gene Cernan's last footprints are still there. Buzz Aldrin's footprints, Armstrong's footprints, all of them perfectly preserved, as if the moon has been waiting. The question of whether humanity will return to add new ones, not just fly by but land, not just visit but stay, is the question that the Artemis program is trying to answer. For the first time in 53 years, the answer is beginning to look like yes. But it is a fragile yes, dependent on sustained political will, adequate funding, and the kind of sustained national and international commitment that ended Apollo the last time around. The technology is not the problem. It never was. It was never a problem of what human beings could do. It was always a problem of what human beings chose to do. Gene Cernan chose, on the 14th of December 1972, to trace his daughter's initials in the lunar soil before he left. He chose to believe he would return. He chose to say so out loud, for the record, so that history would know that the leaving was not intended to be permanent. He was wrong about returning, but he was right about history recording it. History has recorded it. And the story it records is not one of mysterious warnings or alien encounters or government secrets. It is a story about choices, about what a civilization chooses to value, to sustain, to fund, and to continue, and about the cost, measured not in dollars but in decades, of choosing wrongly.